welcome everybody. Good morning. I hope you're all off to a great start, and thank you for joining us today. And welcome to the third South Atlantic Third Thursday Web Forum of 2014. Wow, that was a tongue twister. My name is Lori Barrow, and not only am I your friendly host for today's presentation, but I also serve as the Information Transfer Specialist and the USDA Forest Service Liaison to your cooperative. It looks like most everybody I see on the participants list has joined us for one of these before, but just for posterity's sake, for those of maybe listening into the recording afterward, as the name implies, on the third Thursday of each month, your South Atlantic LCC hosts a web forum that provides an opportunity to share information about what's going on within your cooperative and how it's getting done. It also serves as a chance for folks to ask any questions and provide any input that will help, guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic. There we go. Didn't want to advance on me for a second there. While each forum has roughly the same agenda, today's presentation will be a little special in that next week is actually our annual face-to-face steering committee meeting. And in preparation for it, we wanted to give folks a chance to review and evaluate the progress of your cooperative. That said, today we'll have a 25 to 30-minute presentation with plenty of opportunities for open discussion, followed by a block of time to ask any questions about what we're up to and how it's getting done. So before we get into the heart of the forum, a few logistics. It sounds like most folks have already muted themselves, however, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody because I'm getting a little bit of static. But if you have any questions during the web forum, you can type them directly into the chat box, which I'll be monitoring, or hold them until after the presentation. If you do use the chat box and wish your questions to be read during the open discussion, please remember to send the note to everybody. And I know it gets a little confusing. We all use the same login information for our WebEx, so there's two Ruas up there currently. Rua's, dual man of two places, I guess. So just make sure that you send your question to everybody. And then, of course, at any time during the discussion session, all you need to do is *6 to unmute yourself. The results and feedback from this webinar will be shared and used during the steering committee next week, so please don't be shy about asking any questions and voicing your concerns. Okay, before I mute everybody, are there any immediate questions or concerns before we get into it? Right.
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, I've now muted everybody. So, okay, just a few staff introductions before we get into the presentation. On the line today from your cooperative, we have your coordinator, Ken McDermott, science coordinator, Rua Mordecai, socioeconomic adaptation coordinator, and National Park Service liaison, Janet Jakir, GIS master, Amy Keister, and Brad Pickens, a postdoc fellow at NCSU, who's helping us integrate South Atlantic indicator models into the conservation blueprint. As I mentioned, today's presentation will be an opportunity to gather your insights and thoughts from our web community. And with that, Ken, I'm going to go ahead and let you give a brief introduction, and I'll pass the power over to Rua. And just remember, *6 to unmute yourself.
So thanks, Lori. I think I unmuted myself. You're hearing me?
Yes, we can.
So Lori did a great introduction, but I just wanted to place a little bit of extra emphasis on a couple points, and that is one is that we your staff of the South Atlantic and your steering committee and really all of you, it's important that we try to engage with the broad community that's interested in what the South Atlantic Conservation Cooperative is doing, and that's actually a fundamental guiding principle of, if you look at our strategic plan, it's the way we operate. We want to make sure that not any one voice has sway over another, but that we do the best we can to engage the broad community out there who's interested in landscape conservation and the mission of the cooperative. And so we do that in a variety of ways. We have newsletters. We're always trying to provide anybody an opportunity to participate in work groups, to provide feedback on a variety of things we're doing. And as we've been focused on building version 1 of the blueprint over the last year, there's been a fair number of those opportunities to engage. And so Rua is going to go over some summary feedback that we've heard, give you another opportunity to kind of hear what we've heard from you all, and from our steering committee, and that helps us be better prepared to make sure we're representing all the interests that are out there that are care to provide feedback, that we can do the best job we can of representing that to the steering committee as they make strategic decisions next week about what our next 12 to 18 months of work is in regard to our mission. And then, so Rua's going to go through that real quick. I just want to make sure that you know that we really do take that guiding principle to heart about making sure we're listening and understanding what everybody's interests are and trying to be transparent in the decision making that the cooperative does. So with that, I'll let Rua take it from there, and then I think Lori will have an additional piece that sort of sums up how we get some of your feedback this year too. So thank you very much.
All right, hi everybody. So I think this should be fun. Like Ken said, we're basically going to have steering committee meetings coming up next week, and so I'm just going to go through a few of the different kinds of pieces of information that are going to be up in front of the steering committee, related particularly to the blueprint itself. And so I'm basically splitting this up into 3 sections. And then for after each, we'll have sort of a chance for questions and discussions. And so I'll be synthesizing what we've heard so far from the reviews and other folks, and then we'll have a chance. You'll have a chance to sort of add and tweak. Does it make sense to you? Anything else that should be added to that? So first, it's going to be some of the results from the blueprint review. So this draft of the blueprint has been up for people to review and submit comments online. Feedback on the blueprint uses. So we had that survey up on helping prioritize the different types of uses that you'd like to see your cooperative do over the next year or so. And then also a little bit about how the cooperative might be supporting you in the community over the next year in trying out the blueprint, trying to use it, learning what's working well, what doesn't work, and to help inform the future revisions. So this is the current draft up on the Conservation Planning Atlas of the blueprint itself. So I'm guessing all of you have probably explored it a little bit, and so just a reminder of what it looks like right now. So on to the blueprint review. So results, we had 16 total responses onto the sort of online review component of things. In general, people thought the places looked about right. I've got a star because I'm going to talk about a few of those exceptions. I think in general, across a number of different reviewers from different places, overall the things seem to look about right, but of course there's always room for improvements in certain watersheds. But there were, I think, 3 sort of broad, big-scale geographic issues that have come out in some of the review. The first one related to a little too much of the highest priority category on the coast, and so this dark, you can see that dark purple is the highest priority, and we're pretty much covering the entire coastline with highest priority areas. And shouldn't be surprising given all the sort of interest, the intersection of land and water, all the resources over there. But from a prioritization standpoint and from an action, definitely heard from a few people, and it sort of makes sense. Well, it's kind of hard when everything's highest priority on the coast. The second thing that came up specifically for folks working in some of the aquatic sides is that we ended up with just a little bit too much or too little in the high and highest priority in the Piedmont. So I don't think, none of the reviewers were saying that it may be that we definitely need to have exact equal balance just as much in the Piedmont as in the coastal plain. But it seemed like there were some issues related to particularly the sort of amount of people working there, but also the existing planning for the aquatics that seemed to result in not quite enough distribution in the Piedmont itself. And a third issue that's come out from a member of our user team and in the review is that there are a number of private land conservation opportunities, and this is really seems to be primarily a South Carolina issue. As there's little issues everywhere, but particularly focused on South Carolina, just off the coast, where a lot of these really great private land conservation opportunities are ending up in the further investigation category, where we sort of had some conflict between the existing plans and the workshop information. So that's another sort of issue for further focus that came out of the review. So those are a couple of the sort of general patterns people are seeing. People typically like the large collaborative process. A lot of sort of comments on that process and transparency and how it all came together using the existing plans and some of those things. There are definitely a few exceptions of folks that were hoping for, especially into the future, a little more structured, data-driven approach. So anytime I'm saying these people typically, it's not covering sort of every response, but the general sense of the group. Overall, a lot of people had trouble accessing the information on why a subwatershed was selected. And so this is something we continue to work on and improve. As for those of you that have explored the Conservation Blueprint right now, because of the current way it's presented and served up, with all the conservation actions together and, not making it too easy to access all the different details about why subwatersheds are selected. Some people are having trouble more on the content access side. So we've been working on that a little bit. We've added the ability to look at existing plans and other things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think in general, people wanted to be able to dig a little deeper into why some of these places were selected and important. And the last thing that came up on a number of the reviews is a lot of folks would like to see a finer scale version of the blueprint, particularly folks working in the terrestrial conservation world, something finer than that subwatershed HUC 12 kind of approach. So that's, in general, those are some of the themes that have come out on the review so far. So I just wanted to pause there for folks on the line and see if you had any general thoughts and questions about some of the themes that are emerging from the review. Does this make sense to you? Is there some big things that you think we're missing? So right now, we'll just feel free to, like Lori said, just send a chat to everybody in the chat box if you'd like to type it in, or just *6 to unmute your line. So thoughts and questions about the review results so far. All right. So if you have anything sort of rattling off in your head, there'll be another chance to sort of ask, speak up, add some comments, stuff like that. So key here we're trying to do is, here's the sense we've got from the community. If there are other things, questions you have, but also other things you think were missed in that you'd like to see us mention to the steering committee, feel free to speak up as we go along. Okay, so next up, some of the feedback on blueprint uses. So now we're talking about, so specifics about how you'd like to see your cooperative try to use the blueprint into the future. So we had this online survey here again. There are 15 total responses to this one, and had folks indicate interest in different uses. So low, medium, high. How interested are you in the cooperative using the blueprint for these different types of things? And the uses were brainstormed by our user team and by the steering committee. So we sort of merged those brainstorming that folks have done and put that together and then sent it out to all of you to have a chance to help guide what we focus on. So, but one of the interesting things I'll mention, so I'm going to show you sort of the top, middle, and the bottom. But one thing I wanted to mention is that every single use that I'm talking about was high interest to at least one respondent. So overall, there was a lot of interest in basically all of these. A lot of medium interest, and everything had at least one person that said, I'm highly interested in this. So here are the top three that came out of that survey, the top three uses. And they're really all about, these all came to, bringing in new conservation funds is probably a good way of thinking about how these are all organized. So using the blueprint to work with sort of national nonprofits and foundations to bring new resources to this area, help making proposals in the South Atlantic that align with the blueprint more competitive in national funding competitions, and then using the blueprint to work with national federal programs to bring new funds and resources to the region. So the top three that really came out were sort of, using this collaborative plan as a way to help make us more competitive and try to bring some new resources into this area. So the middle, and so these are some of the other things that ended up being fairly popular, but we're kind of in the middle. So finding the next best places for partnerships, developing a regional water plan was actually a high interest, integrating the blueprint in some existing plans, wildlife action plans, essential fish habitat, that kind of thing. Coordinating monitoring efforts, supporting land acquisition decisions by county open space programs, land trusts. So I'm showing all these basically in the order that they ended up ranking out. Here's the next tier in the middle. Again, bringing the blueprint into climate adaptation plans, funding decisions for existing programs, NACA, Clean Water Act funds. Now we're starting to move into some of the policies. So at the bottom we have developing some creative policy options in blueprint areas, especially with respect to water quality regulations to achieve some of these blueprint actions. So these are some of the things that came out in the middle. And then this is the last section of the middle, which is developing new approaches to conservation incentives, informing some local green infrastructure projects, informing mitigation decisions, and then incorporating the blueprint into disaster response plans. So those are basically some of the middle sections. And the bottom three were related to working with private landowners to develop sustainable timber certifications, using the blueprint to help improve local ordinances, and using the blueprint to find alternatives to endangered species listings. So again, everything I just went through, there were a number of people that had medium interest, and there was at least one person that had high interest in all of these. But overall, this is the sort of the sense of the prioritization that came out of that. So does that order make sense to y'all? Is there something that you think is missing, or maybe not as prioritized as high or as low as you think it should be? Well, open up that general question to everyone out there. *6 to unmute your line. Or same thing, you can go ahead and type something in the chat box just to everyone, and we'll dive in on it.
This is Patty Kelly out of the Panama City Field Office.
Hey, Patty.
So I'm kind of joining in very late in this process, but we were encouraged to maybe start listening in on some of these calls. So I guess I'm surprised. I thought a lot of this was to, I would have thought the endangered species part would have ranked as a higher focus or a higher expectation. Do you agree, or?
I think that was something that I wanted to bring up, and sometimes it helps complementing some of these surveys with more detailed discussions and sort of folks on the line talking about it. So again, this is based on just the 15 responses from a number of folks. A lot of them were on our user team, but again, it was open to everyone. But that one in particular is one I wanted to bring up in case somebody else didn't, because that was one that ranked pretty low on some of the discussions and feedback we've had so far, but is of really high interest at the steering committee level. So I think this might be, and I would throw that open to other folks on your thoughts about why you think that the endangered species listing kind of question was relatively low. And actually, I can pull up. And I may actually just go ahead and call on a few people because I like to cause trouble. So.
Yeah, so it's sort of being sold to us a little bit in that it should be a tool to help prioritize our workload, that we can't, save every piece of land, so that's why I just assumed it would rank very high.
So, Patty, this is Ken McDermott, and maybe I'll stimulate a little conversation here, too. I mean, I guess it's interesting that you've been encouraged to participate in these calls, and I think that maybe part of the issue is that people that are interested in that haven't been engaged with the cooperative as much as others have. And so, again, this is a collaborative, consensus-based organization. Ultimately, decisions are made by the steering committee through a consensus-based approach, informed by as many people as we can get engaged to discuss and provide their perspectives and thoughts. And so if we don't hear that kind of thing, it's not as represented as it maybe could be, but it's only represented by the number of responses and engagement we get. The staff is here to listen to that, provide our own perspectives into it, but make sure that that's as neutral as possible and just trying to scan the horizon about what's going on. But I think it makes the point that we need more people engaged too that care about those kind of things, and if they want the cooperative to work on those sort of things, then we need to hear from folks like that.
Okay, and that makes sense. I think on our side, too, we feel there's a little bit of a disconnect in how do we try to sort of fit into the LCC process more, as well as try to keep up with our current jobs. So I agree that, yeah, we all need to work better at integrating all these programs, especially the process you are walking through.
And I would add, another nuance, and I'm going to kick it over to a couple people here individually too. The specific use case here was using the blueprint to find alternative to endangered species listings. So I think the use as a tool to prioritize, people's actions for overall sort of integrity of the system, a lot of those end up ranking relatively high, those kind of use cases about where we best work together and how we generate new funds. But it seemed like this individual, how do we, with respect to individual species, some of the gopher tortoise work or some of those others, so far hasn't come out as high. And I think it does seem like partly, like Ken said, that there hasn't been as many people that are specific, as focused on the listing aspect of things versus the overall sort of conservation.
Well, and that's a good point, too, is all the other actions targeting conservation are going to inadvertently help us achieve our mission anyway. So I guess maybe it doesn't matter that it specifically hasn't ranked as high. Just sort of a thought that if we were more engaged, we would have ranked it as one of the highest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the, I think the key is this wasn't just about, do we care about endangered species or do we care about diversity and all that, but the specific targeted use of, okay, actually going in, working with the lead for some of these in the mega petitions and seeing, okay, well, what is it, how much do we need to not have this listed? So far hasn't come out as strongly.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and I would, so I'll maybe I'll kick this over to Sarah, since I know you work on some of the aquatic side of things in the ES office in Raleigh. What do you think about that, this being at that level of ranking so far? Sarah McCrae. Oh, and star 6 to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was talking.
I do it so much.
Thanks for the reminder, star 6. Okay. Similar to Patty, I certainly have similar concerns, and I have definitely attempted through this process to try to appeal to those concerns. So when I make those comments, now granted, I am more focused when we're responding to what we think or trying to make priorities. I'm definitely from the perspective of the eastern part of North Carolina, because that's where I'm working from, and that's where I'm trying to relay information for our field office's priorities. And so I've tried to incorporate that into the review process and feedback process, but I'm concerned that because I'm just one lone voice, that it may not necessarily be, an overwhelming, there might not be an overwhelming response because I'm just one person saying these types of things. And it's hard for me to know relative to what other people think. Probably there are other people that are concerned about the same kinds of things, but they're not there. They haven't been reached, or they just didn't have time to respond, or, it's a number of factors that could have gotten in the way of them getting, interacting with this process.
Yeah, that's very helpful, especially, the reason we're having this discussion, too, is to sort of bring in some of this context of, like you, Sarah, and Patty, saying, hey, it's not to say that there isn't, of folks that are working on endangered species things, that are, not deputy director kind of level folks. Yeah, there's real interest in trying to do it and use it in this way. It's just we don't have as many of those voices there. And that's an important distinction or question to be able to sort of talk about and think about, especially as they're considering strategically how important it might be, to try to focus or provide some extra support for this kind of question.
And I'll add to that. This is Brad Pickens from NC State and the South Atlantic LCC. As I've started to reach out to a few more people involved with the indicators that we're measuring, I also get the sense that a lot of folks have probably not had time to be involved with the process, but they are very interested now that the Blueprint 1.0 is out and ready to be approved. I think we'll get more people coming in to look at it as the process goes, as we have a product now.
Yeah, that was definitely part of when the steering committee said, okay, put almost all of your focus on getting a blueprint out in the next year. Part of that idea is, all right, let's have something tangible that we can start on, a starting point, a 1.0, that it's not just boxes and diagrams, so we can start improving it. So actually, and there's a question from here from Mary Long about the response to sort of informing state and local transportation and development plans. And so that one, I'm actually going to go back up here. 1 second. And not in this top 3. But there was actually, so now we're here in the middle, but pretty high up in the middle, interest in working particularly with some of they're sprinkled throughout, and you can see it doesn't come out as well in some of these uses, but in some of the blueprint reviews as well and places, there's a lot of folks that highlighted the importance of working with urban communities and working on some of these urban and development issues. And as you see that as one of the highest uses down here, this sort of county open space programs, working with land trusts and urban communities side of things. So I think there was definitely a desire related to working on some of these urban and development issues. I'm trying to remember exactly where
Rua, maybe I could add in here too, is that, and Mary, I can't recall if you've seen this format before, but these are sort of more specific details about broad categories of uses. And so one of the big broad categories of use cases we talk about is that guiding infrastructure piece. And so some of these things might fall. The mitigation piece, for example, use Blueprint to inform mitigation decisions, is a subset of that use about informing infrastructure decisions. So, broadly, I think it's a use case, and we've actually even tried to engage with, the staff has, and other folks from the Cooperative have tried to engage, for example, with North Carolina DOT, and we didn't have the blueprint ready, and they were in a major transition, and so they weren't quite ready. And then the third thing I say is, this is to figure out, these are sort of the priorities for Blueprint 1.0, and we only have a certain amount of staff capacity to help do what we need to do to facilitate, to the extent that we need to, some of these uses, and those are the ones we're trying to help us get the steering committee to help decide where do we place our existing capacity in helping move some of these things along to get the traction for the blueprint. But it also doesn't, and this goes back to the endangered species piece too, I think, it doesn't mean that some of these other things couldn't get legs if people come to the table and want to bring their own capacity to make them happen. So, or to add capacity to this effort in some way to make those kind of things happen. So this is just what we're hearing is the sort of on people's minds that are kind of the steering committee level and the early adopters that have said, hey, if I'm going to use this, these are the kind of things I'd like to use this for. Rua, is that tracking with you okay, or do you need to straighten that out a little bit?
No, I think that's exactly it. Right now the idea over the next year is to try to learn and for with folks that have stepped forward and say, all right, I want to try to use this first version in some very specific ways. And there's a lot of different ways. Pretty much any of these use cases and then some, people could try to use the blueprint for over the next year. The challenge is more of as the limited staff capacity we have, where does me and Amy and Ken and all of us, how can we best facilitate people trying to use the blueprint in some specific ways without spreading the effort so thin that it doesn't really help anyone. And that's actually what we're going to talk about in this next section of slides as well. But yeah, and also on the use case, this sort of guiding infrastructure development, which is our the third of our six, that actually ranked out relatively high as one of the overall types of uses. That sort of guiding infrastructure development, urban communities, transportation kind of thing came out relatively high in this use as well.
Rua, let me just add one more thing too to the endangered species piece, and I think about Sarah when I say this, and maybe for Patty's benefit and others, is that in the process of developing the blueprint, the expert opinions that were brought in, Sarah was at the table, and I think quite a few other people like her, whether from state, nonprofit, or Fish and Wildlife Service or other agencies, DOD included, that knowledge about the need to conserve, restore, or whatever species that are maybe species and habitats that are in the decline, that information, I think, we believe or hope was well represented in the blueprint itself. So the information should be, and the blueprint should represent that, but that's the testing kind of work we need to do into the future.
I'll go open up the chat box if I'm missing anything. Any other thoughts and questions on this topic before we move on to the next topic about how your cooperative might support use, blueprint use over the next year? Star 6 to unmute yourself, or just type in the chat box for everyone. All right, excellent. That was a very helpful discussion. Okay, so next on support for testing the blueprint use. Okay, so this is a version 1. Certainly not perfect, certainly has a number of issues and improvements to be made. So I wanted to give you an idea of some of the support for trying to actually use this blueprint over the next year. So we'll have for the Planning Atlas support, so Amy Keister, our JS coordinator, Louise Vaughn as well, who I'll mention in a minute, who's going to be helping with the actual sort of accessing the data, so the Conservation Planning Atlas, the support improvements based on how y'all are using it and what's working and what's not. There'll be some additional support. Me and Hillary Morris. Hillary's going to be coming on. She'll be able to help full-time starting a little later in the year. So we'll be providing additional support to folks using the blueprint itself. And other support is going to be determined by the steering committee. So that's going to be one of the questions in front of the steering committee. How do we, as a sort of staff and with the cooperative resources, how can we help foster the use and testing of this blueprint? I'm going to mention a little bit about what Louise has been doing so far. She's been doing what's called paper prototyping with some different folks to start visioning what this blueprint interface should look like. So right now we sort of have it together. It's not perfect. We have the data up, but we're actually been talking with the folks database that provide this platform too, and trying to work with some of the different users. And I know, Sarah, I think you were part of that exercise when Louise came down, to start scoping out, okay, how do you want to use this blueprint? How do you want to interact with it? What kind of decisions do you want to make? How can we improve the current design and access? So her and Amy are going to be working on that side of things, and she's already started with a few different folks, basically trying to start drawing out, like, okay, well, what could we do with this? How would we like to actually interact? And now one of the big questions, which we lead it into a little bit, is sort of how your cooperative helps support the testing and the use over the next year. And in the user team discussions, we had this discussion about, so do we focus support on sort of places and issues where multiple people can work together, or provide individual support for users? And if it's a mix of those two, what's the right balance? And so we had a discussion into the user team about that. A lot of interest in trying to spend a lot of the effort sort of focusing support on some specific places and issues where people intersect. So there's a lot of interest in that, but also sort of the caveat and discussion about providing some individual support could be particularly helpful as well, just for getting some early examples of people using the blueprint. So this is one of the questions that's going to be, the steering committee is going to be thinking about, these sort of how much you put in each bucket. And so I'm going to show you just an example of some ways of doing that across the blueprint that combine these sort of places and issues that we might be talking about at the steering committee meeting. So there's the blueprint here. Here's an example of one particular issue. And so this issue of threatened corridors, where are these sort of key connections that are high priority, but are also subject to rapid change, sea level rise, urban growth. So here's an example of 5 of them where there are multiple sort of early adopters from the South Atlantic that are all sort of interested in doing something in the same kind of place. And all of them have their own stories and situations. So, you have this Roanoke Retreat corridor. There are a number of federal agencies that are particularly interested in trying to work in this area, and there's also a refuge expansion going on at Roanoke, where Pam Wimgrove, who's one of the user team members, wants to do it. The Sweetgrass Highway, you have an intersection of some major important marine and coastal resources, the Francis Marion planning, the Gullah Geechee. So a number of these all sort of have multiple early adopters, basically at least 2 folks that want to try to use the blueprint over the next year. And so that's one example of combining the sort of places and issues. Here's another example. This is sort of the living shorelines. And so, one of the things about living shorelines is it helps leverage this unique niche in the South Atlantic, or in LCC in general, of sort of the land-water connection, that sort of ocean up to land connection. It's an adaptation strategy. There's a lot of momentum behind it. A lot of people are talking about it as being the sort of next Longleaf as far as its ability to leverage resources. And there are a number of places throughout the geography where there are a number of early adopters, both people in city, local governments, and federal agencies and nonprofits that are all interested in trying to use the blueprint in similar places. So those are some examples of spots. So that's one way to slice it. A third way, and a third sort of issue thing relates to endangered species. So we were talking about that issue before, and I think that's going to be a question that's come up the steering committee is particularly interested in as well. So we could also, look at focusing around some specific species where a lot of people have been interested in this sort of, okay, how do we work together to keep something off the list? So here's your general area where robust red horse are, gopher tortoise, some of these species that touch a lot of people, and there's maybe some opportunities for collective action to avert any need for listing. So that's another example of slicing the landscape up by sort of places and issues. Now, there's others you can include too. I mean, some of these aquatics with smaller range distributions or other opportunities as well. So those are just some ideas and some of the thinking about, okay, how do you balance finding some places and issues where people can work together versus supporting people individually. So with that, thoughts and questions on that issue about how you'd like to see support happen for blueprint use over the next year. So again, *6 to unmute yourself, or feel free to just type in the chat box. Just make sure you're sending it to everyone. So I'll give you a minute or so to digest that and think about it.
Yeah, this is Sarah.
Hey, Sarah.
I really appreciate having like Louise come out and sort of interface with some of us to sort of talk about how we can use this or how we see it being used, and then also just sort of keeping people well informed through these forums and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I definitely think that that's very positive, and I'm glad to hear that you've got more people coming on board to sort of interact with mm-hmm. folks as things tweak and we figure out how to best use this. So just kudos to you all for doing that.
Excellent. Yeah, that's going to be a major focus over this next year of really trying to reach out to folks and help improve them based on what you're doing. Plus, it's fun. It's fun stuff. So I'm glad that seemed to work well for you.
Any other ideas about how we can improve on that, or do you think that now that the blueprint's out, the people will start seeing it, and getting attention and more focus? That's sort of a question to everybody, I guess.
Hey, Ken, this is Gino.
Hey, Gino.
I think the priority is going to have to remain on the kind of large partnership places, because I think that's where this provides the greatest opportunity. But at the same time, I think some of the individual assistance could be really, really important on a smaller scale. I guess it's going to be we hope that it gets as popular enough to be a resource limitation effort for your staff. Mm-hmm. My sense would be the priority is probably the larger landscape, but not to diminish at all the value of kind of the individual assistance as your resources allow.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting on the call that we had with the user group, Gino and others, was that I think that was sort of probably the conventional wisdom what you're saying, but somebody made the point that you could learn quicker by focusing on a small individual organization or decision maker about how well the blueprint actually can inform a specific kind of a decision. Mm-hmm. So that would be the value of learning. It wouldn't be necessarily the overall value of the blueprint to make a big impact, but you could learn quicker by focusing on some smaller scale or individual organizations or decision makers about how the blueprint actually can work to inform action. So anyway.
I think the nuance there was it was not necessarily, I think when Mark was saying, not necessarily that you would learn quicker, but you would get an example of it actually being used faster. So if you wanted it to be,
both,
it's a little bit of both, but it is sort of that interesting caveat about the sort of balance of, with additional individual support, you could maybe move a little quicker and have some examples versus that broader partnership. But it seems like no matter what, I mean, based on the discussion in that user group, and I think your point, Gino, about that as sort of it's probably not going to be one or the other. It's going to be some kind of how much do we put in each bucket, how much percentages-wise kind of thing do we spend on one versus the other. Definitely.
And a lot of that might evolve once the blueprint's out and people start actually trying to use it. You might get a better sense then of where your resources are most needed.
Right. I think that's right.
Yep.
Hey guys, we've had 2 questions come in through the chat box, and I'll just note that they did come through privately. So again, I know it's kind of a silly thing, but if you do want them to be seen by the group, please make them public. But I'll just go ahead and read them out. One indicated, is there some sort of link to a roll-up of projects being executed in the priority areas?
That is a really great question, and that's something that we've talked about as a staff of this sort of question, and that's sort of come up in discussion about, boy, yeah, wouldn't it be powerful to show what's already going on in these places? And we've done a little of investigation with some of the existing databases that are tracking some of that on the technical side to see if we can sort of pull in, so a way you could actually look at the blueprint and then dive into a HUC and see what people are already doing and where they're working kind of thing to roll that up. It's a big challenge. I know a lot of other partnerships have struggled with that, trying to capture the actions, if that's the question you were actually getting at. But yeah, that's something we've talked about a little bit, and that's come out, and I think, from I remember right, some of the little paper prototyping we've done as well, folks wanting to see what's already been done.
Thanks, Rua. And then there was one more. Sorry to cut you off there if somebody had a question on that or a follow-up, but the next one is, are there plans for an RFP related to using the blueprint?
And that is an excellent question as well, and I think that's something that the steering committee is going to be talking about as far as the sort of resources and how we support things. You know, will there be a request for proposals for supporting specific types of blueprint uses? And yeah, I think that's to be determined as far as what the sort of best uses and pieces. The idea is to, in moving so quickly to this sort of version 1 and updating our version 2, is to try to get as quickly down to the individual uses and make it real for people, so we can start identifying, okay, what are the real barriers that we need to focus collectively some additional resources to resolve. But yeah, I think it's a good question about both, will there be an RFP, and also what will it look like? Other comments, questions, thoughts on that topic?
We had one more just come in. The priority areas are pretty broad. Do you anticipate doing a future version that could fine-tune priority areas, highest of high, etc., that could help us for fine-scale projects?
Yeah, if we're talking about spatially, sort of, something more detailed than those big HUC 12 boundaries, that was one of the comments we got a lot, and that's something that is definitely going to be on deck for exploration in version 2, which we plan to shoot to have approved by the steering committee by basically spring of next year, so moving pretty rapidly through this process. But I haven't heard so much on the, if you're talking about maybe finer detail in this sort of prioritization, highest priority and high, but more detail within that. So that's a good thing we can think about. A lot of the discussion so far about slicing them up has been making it easier to sort of see, okay, what are the benefits of these? Okay, that's highest, but show me the highest area for aquatic conservation. That's land acquisition. Show me the highest priority for longleaf, more of a resource-based switch. But yeah, I haven't heard so much about more detail in the highest ranking, so I'll have to keep thinking about that one. It's a good point. Is that getting at the question you were asking, whoever typed that one in?
She said yes, thanks.
Gotcha. And I think I see something from Marshall too about sort of feedback from folks initiating projects within the priority areas could be tallied and would show how the blueprint is being used too. And that's something we're talking about as a staff too, how to track the blueprint, not just the sort of some of the projects that are happening in there, but also try to investigate what's the impact of the blueprint. Are these things that people are doing, the sort of but-for question? What's happening, what's changing specifically because of the blueprint versus things that may happen already? So, any new resources we might bring in, any decisions that might get changed. That's another topic we'll be trying to think about, tracking who's using it, but also trying to get at some of the, what's the collective impact of having this plan and working together as well. All right, so before we move on to the next little section, any other comments or things you'd like brought forward to the steering committee or questions or comments?
And Rua, this is Ken. I guess I would also encourage people that, most folks I think on the line have probably some representation on the steering committee, and that's another vehicle for you to communicate with to get your perspectives and interests represented as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, excellent. That's a good point as well. Okay, the last thing I wanted to just hit before we turn it back over to Lori, the next steps, which she's kind of already talked about in a number of ways. So, steering committee meeting is basically next week. And some of the questions we had, so we'll be bringing some of these comments, folding it into what we've heard so far from the surveys. And so we'll add some of the results from some of this discussion to what we talk about in front of the steering committee. And some of the steering committee members are on the call, so Marshall and Gino and others will have been here for this discussion. And then basically starting in April, it's going to be trying to use the blueprint, testing it, learning, and working on developing a 2.0 based on what we're all sort of collectively learning as we all try to use this thing. And then targeting a Blueprint 2 by spring of 2015. So this is going to be basically, targeting a steering committee meeting, adoption kind of thing within a year. So there'll be a way to help improve. And this also, and I mentioned this a lot, but just as sort of a reminder, the plan is by spring of 2015 to have the South Atlantic blueprint merged with the equivalent conservation design in Peninsular Florida. So we have a joint plan that cuts across the South Atlantic and Peninsular Florida. So that's the next steps. With that, let me go ahead and I can either hand it back to you, Lori, or you can just steal it.
I'm stealing the power. It's all mine. Okie dokie. Well, while this is kind of queuing up, I just wanted to let folks know, I know a couple of you came in just a tiny bit late, so we are recording these, and you will find an archived link to all of them on underneath the web forum tab for in the news on our South Atlantic LCC site. So you'll find both the recorded video of it as well as the saved PowerPoint presentation on there. So to kind of wrap up the conversation, I just wanted to give a brief overview and remind folks. So you all might remember that the South Atlantic undertook its first stakeholder survey last year about this time. The results from last year were compiled into our first annual report card, and now we're looking to once again check back in with you to get your thoughts on how the Cooperative's been doing over the past months. So you guys should have received several email notifications and reminders and with a link to the stakeholder survey, but if you haven't seen it yet, you can find it on our website underneath my blog post titled Help Evaluate Your South Atlantic LCC. So I just wanted to provide a brief snapshot. So far we've had about 40 responses, and we've been getting some great feedback on the types type of tools and resources you would like to see available through the South Atlantic, as well as overall satisfaction with your cooperative based on our goals and guiding principles. And these results will be compared with last year's and presented during next week's steering committee. And then once again, I'll be compiling an annual report. And I think I haven't posed this yet to Ken and Rua, but I was hoping to actually do a presentation on kind of the stakeholder survey in an upcoming third Thursday. So we'll discuss that more after this, but it hit me last night that might be a good presentation. So again, just a sneak peek, 64% of the 40 participants felt that they knew a fair amount about the work of the South Atlantic LCC, and 75% of folks thought that we either met or exceeded expectations in communicating our progress. Just a snapshot of overall perceptions related to Goal 1, which is providing that blueprint, which we've talked extensively about on this call. So, roughly 60% felt that we either met expectations or exceeded expectations in delivering on Goal 1. And then there's also numerous opportunities to kind of just voice concerns, comments, ideas, just any of those open discussions throughout the survey. So one of the questions was, in the future, what type of tools or resources would you like to see available through the South Atlantic LCC? And one that kind of hit me that was brought up during this discussion was the one to the right, finer resolution conservation blueprint. So that's something that has definitely been voiced numerous times and something that I'm sure we'll discuss multiple times during next week's steering committee call. The other comment that I just pulled, and this is just one of many of the comments that have gone through, is a list of projects supported by the LCC with clear, simple linkages to LCC conservation priorities. So I just wanted to provide a brief snapshot that this is still up and running and that you can voice your comments, and I will be it'll be open until Monday and open past that, but the results that the steering committee will see will be the results that I've compiled since over the past couple of weeks, and we'll be presenting that on Tuesday next week. So, gosh, it's being slow. So with that, I just wanted to give a few last updates and closing remarks. So again, that ongoing stakeholder survey, you can find it through my blog post on the southatlanticlcc.org site. And just one other update I wanted to share. Back in February, the Gulf Coast LCCs and NOAA were looking to fill the position of the Gulf Coast Landscape Conservation Liaison position previously held by Lori Rounds. Yesterday, I got a little email indicating that position has been filled, and we're by Amanda Watson, and we're looking forward to working with Amanda and getting to know her. And other than that, Ken and Rua, I think we covered most of all of our other updates during the presentation. I just wanted to do a last-minute check back with you guys to see if I missed anything.
I think you're good for my end here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Well, since it's almost 10 o'clock, we'll keep on moving. Just a reminder, giving folks a heads up that the next third Thursday web forum will take place April 17th, same time, same place, and will feature Steve Frank, a professor at NCSU, discussing discussing a presentation entitled "Can Forests Take the Heat? Managing Pests and Ecosystem Services in a Warming Climate." And finally, we always want to make sure folks know how they can get involved in the cooperative. So besides taking that survey, you can tell I'm really hitting hard on that survey. I really want to up that response rate, get it up from 40. So in addition to that, you can also, please feel free to contact any of us directly. We have a highly active webpage, and we really want to know your thoughts, ideas, and research. You are the cooperative. And your thoughts and opinions matter. So feel free to either directly engage with your steering committee representative, as Ken mentioned, or just pick up the phone and give any one of us a buzz. So with that, I'll go ahead and open the floor for any additional questions or last-minute concerns that folks might have, had an aha moment throughout. And with that, I'll just open the floor. Just remember, *6 to unmute yourself. All right. If there's no additional questions, we are at exactly 11 o'clock. So I know I kind of whipped through that last little presentation, but always feel free to give any of us a little buzz or shoot us an email. And thank you, everybody, for participating in today's Third Thursday Web Forum. And I hope you all have a nice day.